My name is Eero Vuorio, and in this webinar I will be telling you about research infrastructure environment in Europe. By my own background, I'm a scientist, professor of molecular biology, but I have had a number of different tasks with European research infrastructures, including serving as a part-time executive manager of BBMRI that we will be using as an example in many cases. The rest of my commitments you can read about in this slide. Before actually defining what research infrastructures are, I think it's fair to briefly describe a process which actually has in a way redefined what research infrastructures in Europe mean. And this is the ESFRI project, the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures. This is a bottom-up process whereby the ESFRI, established by European Union in the early 2000s, invited the scientific communities in all fields of science to make proposals as to what would be the key research infrastructures needed for their progress in the next 10 to 20 years. This process resulted in the first ESFRI Roadmap in 2006, where 35 research infrastructures were listed, and I will come back to the definitions a bit later. This was followed by two updates in 2008 and 2010, whereby the number of research infrastructures increased to 48. Now, 6 years later, the new roadmap was renamed to be a strategy report on research infrastructures because most of the early roadmap infrastructures were already operational and they were called as landmarks. Furthermore, the new strategy report contained 21 projects. Some were new, some were actually those from the previous roadmaps which had not yet been developed into a real research infrastructure. So, in a sense, this is a real landscape analysis. As I said, the EU Council of Research Ministers set up ESFRI in 2002. There were 27 member states, 10 associated states, and the European Commission involved. And the aim was to set up a coherent and strategy-led approach to policy making on research infrastructure. And the roadmap was the tool. So, originally, I would say 20-30 years ago, research infrastructure essentially meant very large, expensive equipment such as CERN, the various types of astrophysics infrastructures. But during the ESFRI process, since all fields of science were included, a new definition stemmed from the proposals that were considered to be useful for further development. Research infrastructures can be single-sited, distributed, or virtual services provided electronically. I will come back to these definitions a little later. An important aspect is that in all cases considered for the roadmap, the infrastructures were to apply to an open access policy. They should be available to all European scientists, of course, based on open competition and selection by peer reviewers. A single-sited research infrastructure is, as the name implies, one large physical facility, such as fusion energy, space and particle physics equipment, which requires very large and very expensive equipment, which means all member states have to jointly fund such an expensive facility, and CERN is a perfect example of this one. Many of the new infrastructures on the roadmap turn out to be more like distributed research infrastructure. Typically, there were in several member states, sometimes even all member states, sets of equipment or data which were basically in lack of networking, in lack of real interoperability. And to get such research infrastructures going, the distributed model was considered to be very important. The BBMRI-ERIC, Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Infrastructure, the Pan-European Biobank, serves as an example of distributed research infrastructure, and I will just show one slide to demonstrate what it really looks like. Here in the center is a core, the headquarters of such an infrastructure, which can be rather small. In case of BBMRI-ERIC, it is located physically in Graz, Austria, and then the national nodes or hubs, as they are called, are located in all the member states that participate in such an infrastructure. Within these national infrastructures, there can be various types of substructures, as illustrated also: biobanks, biomolecular repositories, technology centers. They can be hospitals, universities, service providers, and they may also have associated partners. But the core obviously is a jointly funded headquarters. Oftentimes this is called the distributed hub and spoke structure for an infrastructure. Virtual research infrastructures basically mean that almost all of the data that is stored in such an infrastructure is in digital format. And this, of course, is what is happening in almost all fields nowadays. Typically, for instance, for humanities and social sciences, but also for life sciences, genomics, structural biology, very, very large data sets are produced, and they have to be stored someplace for verification. Oftentimes, they need to be revisited, they need to be accessed, and in such a case, even the data sets can be in many different member states, and the central core coordinating all of these activities is actually quite small. Such infrastructures are basically only accessible through the internet. CESDA, Clarin are, for instance, examples of social sciences and genomics, and proteomic databases of Elixir, examples of life science research infrastructures which are primarily virtual in nature. The ESFRI Roadmap essentially divided the sciences, the research infrastructures, into these 7 areas, and those are actually followed then through the whole roadmap, which is illustrated here. Above there are the 7 domains, and then we have the acronyms of the different infrastructures for the different disciplines. The yellow ones are primarily highlighting the distributed type of research infrastructures, and the blue ones, the single-sited research infrastructures. And here it is quite clear that it is basically physics, material sciences, and energy research where the single-sited heavy equipment infrastructures are located. An important matter to consider is who are the stakeholders of research infrastructures. It's quite clear that researchers, the users of the research infrastructures, were the driving force of this bottom-up process. But equally important, we have to consider the member state governments, ministries, who are the actual owners of research infrastructures, who in the end are also the funders. Sometimes funding organizations are delegated the task of funding the research infrastructures, but it's still the same government money that we're talking about. Policymakers are increasingly looking towards solid data so that they would have a foundation for their policy decisions. The databases should be very useful for them. Industry is very much hoping access not only to high-end equipment that they do not have themselves, but also to some of the results that stem for such research, because someone has to also take these discoveries forward. I list society as an entity, as a real stakeholder. This is, of course, particularly clear for study subjects, be them medical or social sciences subjects. Patients, patient organizations are very important drivers of some projects. We have to consider all universities and hospitals as entities, the clinicians involved, public health organizations, registries. But what is important to note is that the stakeholder groups vary between the different research infrastructures. It is quite clear that there are some specific, more field-oriented users groups as well. But this is a very large group of people who are interested in getting the research infrastructures to operate efficiently. Another interesting feature of the ESFRI process, and I think this is a very positive feature, is that very soon after the first roadmap, and sometimes even before the ESFRI roadmap came out, a great majority of EU member states and also some other European countries produced their own research infrastructure roadmaps. The aim is here to help the governments essentially design priority lists of where they should put their scarce funding, and this has, I think, structured the whole European landscape considerably. If we take one group of research infrastructures, and this is the one that I know best, these are the ones from the biological and medical sciences infrastructure. We can see that the European map is colored differently depending on which infrastructure we talk about. Big countries typically are involved in all of them. Smaller ones are participating only in those where they think they have sufficient competence to participate, to contribute, and sometimes even to benefit. And it is oftentimes called variable geometry in the Brussels jargon. Funding of research infrastructures is obviously a very critical issue. If we think about the large single-sited infrastructures, they are typically funded by several member countries through some specific agreements, typically through an intergovernmental organization with its own governance system and financial model for calculating the size of the national contributions. Such are, for instance, CERN, also EMBL, European Molecular Biology Organization, although it is not only a research infrastructure, it's also a training laboratory and a research laboratory. And ESA, the European Space Agency, ESO, the European Southern Observatory. No single country has sufficient funds to fund these very big, large, single-sited infrastructures. But jointly, Europe has been making excellent progress in these areas. With distributed infrastructures, it is quite clear that the participating countries typically fund their own national infrastructure that remains on their soil, but they also have to contribute to the coordination center, oftentimes called headquarters of the research infrastructure, in order to coordinate all the different activities. And in fact, most life science research infrastructures belong to this category. This is an area where a lot of, should I say, disagreement and a lot of discussion have been had regarding what would be the correct way to determine the national contributions towards a joint budget. At the other end of the extreme is that every country should pay the same amount of money and have one vote in the governance system. However, if you consider that Germany is about 500 times bigger than Malta, it seems rather unreasonable to expect them to contribute at the same level. The other extreme is probably the model used by the intergovernmental organizations, at least EMBL, where each member country has one vote and the national contributions are based on the gross domestic product of the country. Actually, it's an average 3 years GDP. But anyway, this has functioned amazingly well because all financial decisions in EMBL are made by unanimous approval of the budget. So the country which has the least money to pay is actually the one that determines the budget. And many of the research infrastructures that have been set up, although the budgets are very small, have had major discussions and various types of solutions to deciding how the joint budget of the coordination office will be handy. The virtual research infrastructures typically follow a rather similar model for distributed research infrastructures. Data collected nationally to a national repository is paid by the host country, oftentimes in a project that may have other funders as well. But still, there is also a need for a small budget for some kind of headquarters. What is very important to keep in mind is the financial sustainability. I have sometimes said that politicians are very eager to put money into some big facilities where they can go and have their photographs taken in front of the building or the equipment, but then nobody is interested in funding the running costs of these large research infrastructures. And these are very expensive indeed. They require a lot of technical staff. They need constant updates of equipment. The maintenance costs of equipment are remarkable. There are reagent costs. The databases use huge amounts of energy and so on. So sustainable funding of research infrastructures is a key. Maybe this is one of the reasons why the research infrastructures typically have made commitment for at least 5 years of funding by all the participating members. It's of course clear that user fees can cover at least some of the expenses coming from the research infrastructures, but it is not easy to foresee a model where the users would be paying for all the costs of the running costs of research infrastructures. User fees are obviously one way to cover at least some of these expenses, and indeed they are being used. One cannot expect to have access to a research infrastructure which is very expensive for no cost. So, but on the other hand, it is quite clear that it's unreasonable to expect that any of the existing research infrastructures could become self-sustainable, would be able to collect enough fees so that they would essentially cover all the expenses. I understand that there has recently been a meeting in Brussels where this was discussed at very high level, and the end result was the same. There needs to be a funding mechanism for the research infrastructure which is sustainable. Governance of research infrastructures is an important aspect when one thinks about the pan-European nature of the new infrastructures on the ESFRI roadmaps. When the first one was published in 2006, there were no clear, straightforward governance models available for research infrastructures. The intergovernmental organizations which I have mentioned, CERN, EMBL, ESA, ESO, did have, however, well-functioning and, should I say, well-tested governance systems that provided one model which many European countries and ministries were familiar with. However, it turned out to be that this is not enough, and in the end the European Union, the European Commission, created its own legal instrument for research infrastructure, the so-called ERIC, which stands for European Research Infrastructure Consortium. This document can be downloaded from the website very easily. It's an interesting legal framework because it facilitates the joint establishment and operation of research infrastructures. It's part of the EU legislation, and it is a legal personality which is recognized in all EU member states. And in fact, most of the research infrastructures from the ESFRI Roadmap have in the end adopted the ERIC model, or at least applied for the ERIC model. To give it a bit more concrete here, I will give one example, and this is the governance structure of BBMRI-ERIC, the biobank that I've been talking about. It's a distributed research infrastructure. The statutes that we were drafting were initially based on the agreement to establish EMBL, in fact, partially because many of the members of the preparatory body were already at least somewhat familiar with the organization and its governance. When the ERIC regulation became effective during this process, the governance model was slightly adjusted in this direction in pretty close dialogue with the European Commission, for whom this was also a test bed. And the next slide here shows the governance model. You can see that it has 3 layers. There is a decision-making layer, the executive layer, and the operative layer. Based on the ERIC regulation, the Assembly of Members is the highest decision-making body, where each member state has a representative or 2, and it can elect its own finance committee, and indeed this has taken place. And the chairs and vice chairs of these 2 aforementioned structures form the governance board together with the Director General, who presents his case there. Furthermore, you can see in this governance structure that the important role of stakeholders is recognized, and there is a separate stakeholder forum whereby the biobank can get feedback from the different stakeholders. And there is also an independent scientific and ethical advisory board. I have not talked much about ethics. In this case, it requires a separate lecture, but it's quite important that when one works with human samples, particularly even human DNA sequence, there are a number of ethical issues and a very rigorous data protection system required. But this one already, it's important to have an outside opinion on all the decisions made. The executive part of the governance structure is the Director General and a relatively small central executive management office located in Graz, Austria. There is an administrative director, and I believe approximately 8 persons hired at the present time, many of them, however, with EU project money rather than member state money. And a very important group here listed as part of the executive one is the management committee. You can see there at the operative level that for each country there will be one single national node, and the node has a director. They represent the country in the executive management of BBMRI-ERIC. Each node has a director. They are the national coordinators. They are the ones who know. They are the scientifically oriented individuals who communicate between the leadership, the Assembly of Members, and the national activities in biobanking. Furthermore, for BBMRI, there are also some common services which are commonly funded, They are related to ethical, legal and societal issues, to IT services, and also to common other sample and data access. The attractiveness of BBMRI-ERIC to member states has been quite good. In fact, with more than 20 members and observers, BBMRI-ERIC is among the largest of the ESFRI research infrastructures so far. So why do member states want to join this infrastructure and spend some of their money on it? It is quite clear that from scientific point of view, very large sample sets representing different European populations are needed to understand the molecular heterogeneity of diseases, their genetics, and without such an efficiently organized structure, access to these samples would be extremely difficult. At the same time, BBMRI-ERIC provides a fantastic platform for sharing experience, expertise, and it also provides a possibility for member states to make in-kind contributions towards a good goal of biobanking. Now, how does one actually set up a research infrastructure? I have to say that the process is oftentimes quite slow. Before one can even start applying for a research infrastructure, like it was done for the first ESFRI Roadmap in 2005, the scientific community has to come together, decide that there is a common goal, or maybe even several common goals, and there is a real need for joint activities at European level. Typically, this requires one or a few driver individuals, leaders who would be taking this rather tedious process to a happy end. With BBMRI, the biobanking activity, it was selected on the first ESFRI Roadmap. It was essentially actually first two separate applications, but in this dialogue process, they were fused together, and this project or this proposal was considered mature enough to be included on the roadmap. To be on the roadmap made it possible for the group of proposers became eligible to funding by European Commission. You had to write an application for the preparatory phase, and the preparatory phase was to essentially help and fund getting all these individuals, member states and participating scientists together to make a business plan, to agree on the statutes of the infrastructure, how it actually would work. The preparatory phase of BBMRI started in February 2008. It was already at the beginning the largest preparatory phase, which grew into almost unmanageable dimensions. There were 54 partners to this project and 227 associated partners. You could not even send an email to these people because it became classified as spam right away. We had to communicate through the secure website. The initial application for the preparatory phase was for 2 years only, but this was clearly overly optimistic, and the Commission extended it by 1 year without any additional funding though. But even then, there was not enough agreement on the statutes and on the business plan, on the financial model, when the preparatory phase came to an end in January 2011. But the negotiations were continued with the same staff, the same participants, under a preparatory body, which was essentially built under a memorandum of understanding. By that time, Austria had volunteered and had been accepted as the host country for the ERIC, and they took the leadership of the final negotiations. And indeed, then in July 2012, ERIC application was sent to Brussels, and a year and a half later, in November 2013, the statutes were published in the European official newspaper, and the BBMRI-ERIC became a legal entity, a reality. This is 8 years after the initial application and nearly 6 years after the beginning of the preparatory phase. So that's why I said it's rather slow. In these two graphs, which are directly from ESFRI, you can see in a graphic form the same. So writing a proposal, and this is true also for today, you send your proposal, the scientific community sends a proposal to ESFRI, typically through a member state or many member states. There's typically a requirement for a minimum number of the member states to apply. It is being sent to the different thematic working groups and evaluated for its pan-European dimension, its science case, the technical case, the business case, and the overall maturity. As the arrow indicates, it also can go back to ESFRI and the proposals for rewriting, and then if things go fine, ESFRI will include it in its next roadmap. And this roadmap then makes the project eligible for European Commission funding of the preparatory phase to finalize concept and design, the organization, the legal framework, the business plan, and the finance model. ESFRI can serve here as an incubator role, but this was not really so much the case in the early stage. And then finally, member states will have to come together, decide on the funding of the implementation phase, and agree also on the funding of the operation. And typically, European Commission supports this process also through various types of funding instruments that are available through the framework programs. As an example of how the roadmap has developed, here are the 6 research infrastructures in the biological and medical sciences domain: biobanking, translational research, clinical research, bioinformatics, model organisms, and structural biology, with the acronyms listed here. 2 years later, 4 new infrastructures were included in the list: marine biology, high security laboratories, chemical biology, biological and medical imaging, and another 2 years later, yet 3 additional infrastructures were listed. There's one for ecosystems, which is maybe marginally involved in the BMS domain, but systems biology and microbial repositories are definitely very much part of it. In fact, most of these infrastructures have already reached their implementation stage, mainly as ERICs. Some of them have not yet gone there, but they're still listed in the landscape analysis of the ESFRI of 2016. So the process continues. The mature ones are now considered part of the infrastructure landscape, and they are no more considered by the ESFRI as such, but new ones may actually be coming up to this 2018, when is the next call for proposals for the ESFRI roadmap. So what are the main challenges encountered during setting up ESFRI research infrastructure? I believe it's clear-cut to say that money is a very limited factor. All research infrastructures are expensive to set up and operate. The salaries and operational expenses we already discussed to some extent. But even if we talk about distributed research infrastructures, member states have to invest in their own infrastructure in this particular area, and also find funding towards the common operating hub headquarters, so that the whole interoperability, standardization, harmonization of the national nodes becomes reality. It turned out to be quite challenging to agree on a governance model where the voting rights and the financial contributions would be agreeable to all member states who are willing to participate. European countries are very different in size, and how to balance the voting rights and the financial contributions do not have a single solution. My personal feeling is that in the long run, when operating research infrastructures, this is less of a problem. Everybody has the same scientific goal, and in the end, this is a relatively efficient way of using relatively little funding to the common headquarters. But this is only my personal view. Time is obviously an issue where we realized that finding agreement on the statutes was very time consuming, and particularly since the high level ministerial representatives joined the process late at the end of the preparatory phase, they were not prepared sufficiently to make the right decisions. They were not informed well enough about the issues at stake. And it took time to really find kind of a participation of all the parties involved. Another equally challenging issue is that the ERIC regulation is interpreted at member state level very differently. In many cases, this requires high-level decisions. In my own country, Finland, even the parliament had to vote on decision whether Finland should participate in an ESFRI infrastructure or not. Most countries do it much more easily. What is interesting is, and I think we all know it when we start thinking about it, is that there are a lot of national and regional interests in European countries, and there are definitely European and global interests between countries. And this creates a number of tensions. It's sometimes even the location of the headquarters can be an issue of disagreement, not in case of BBMRI, but the location of major equipment and these common services are always up to discussions, and there are no easy way out of it. Oftentimes, scientific evaluation is the best way to make the way forward, but we also are very good at making compromises in Europe. What is important is that we have to think about when to select the director general or director and the administrative director. And I think, again, the procedure of selecting these individuals, although there are models how to do this type of work, took a lot of time and a lot of discussion. And we had a search committee for both persons, and in the end, the decisions were unanimous, but the unanimous state was not reached, should I say, right away. Sometimes there have even been discussions about what is the operational language of an infrastructure. It should be noted that many of the intergovernmental organizations have meetings in simultaneous translation between English, German, and French. And there are other combinations too. So, there is a lot of additional information that could be given in a presentation like this. I have listed here some of the websites. The ESFRI website lists all the roadmaps and a lot of additional information about European research infrastructure. The ERIC regulation can be downloaded as a PDF file. I started looking for the websites of the life science infrastructures. Then at some point I realized that all you have to do is take Google and write the acronym and infrastructure, and you will find a hit almost immediately. If you want to look at EMBL or CERN, which are complicated organizations, there are the websites. And of course, in the end, if all else fails, you can always contact me.